should be rightly the ones conducting. And so what we did is we conducted a survey of almost 2,500 respondents through this company called Lucid. And the sample itself is nationally representative on things like gender, age, education, and race. And we asked respondents to two different questions. And these questions sought to get at this difference between whether or not people are deferential to the military about whether to use force. And the second one emphasized tactical and operational decisions. So the first question we asked respondents was, when considering the use of military force abroad, we should first and foremost trust the judgment of U.S. military leaders regarding whether to deploy U.S. forces. And the second question was set up the same way, but instead of asking them whether to deploy U.S. forces, we asked them about how to use U.S. forces on the battlefield. So when considering the use of military force abroad, we should first and foremost trust the judgment of U.S. military leaders regarding how to use U.S. forces on the battlefield. And what we found was that nearly 70% of Americans agreed to some extent that the country should defer to the military on whether to use force. And so that's the strategy question. That's the question that really, and sort of the classic theory of civil-military relations, should be left up to civilian leaders. And just 17% disagreed to some extent with that premise, that military leaders should have say in whether to use force.
So, Mr. Ralston, I'm sorry to interrupt. Did you find that result particularly surprising? And can you talk a bit about what were maybe the more detailed findings that you found most surprising in the study?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. It was surprising because, and in fact, a lot of the reaction we've been getting to this on Twitter is kind of shock that people who study civil military relations sort of assumed that the public wouldn't be nearly as deferential regarding whether to use force in sort of the strategic context. And it wasn't necessarily surprising to us that the people that were more likely to endorse deference were those that you'd kind of expect demographically. They were more likely to be male, more likely to be conservative, more likely to be Republican. These are conservatives and Republicans generally tend to trust the military more, and so that wasn't particularly surprising. But military veterans were also more likely to endorse this idea of deference to the military, which in some ways was surprising if you think about sort of folks in the military sort of understanding their role and sort of being indoctrinated by their training and their upbringing in the military to kind of see this as sort of the right way to go. And so that was probably the most surprising of the findings for me personally. I don't know if Ron has any other surprising findings coming out of this, but the military veteran one was really quite striking to me. At least it seemed problematic that military veterans felt this way. But it also makes sense in the sense that they're invested and they have this close tie, obviously, with the military as being members of it, that they might feel deferential as well.
Dr. Krebs, what about you?
I would just add that we did find, one thing that was not surprising, right, which would have been expected based on the normal theory of civil military relations, is that we did find that Americans were more deferential in the arena of tactics than they were in the arena of strategy. But the part that was surprising, right, we're used to seeing, we all know and have known for a long time, that Americans trust the military more than they do other institutions. They have a more generally favorable attitude toward the military. Those are the general questions that surveys normally ask. Those surveys have not delved more deeply into this question of trust them about what. And we did think that we would see a much bigger gap between trust on questions of whether to use force than how to use force. And it isn't that Americans didn't behave perfectly in accord with the traditional theory of civil military relations that surprised us. It was the extent of that deference. And the other thing I would say is that while what Robert said is true, men were generally more deferential than women, conservatives more deferential than liberals, Republicans more deferential than Democrats. The part that was surprising was how much in general this was a consensus position across virtually every cleavage and divide in the American body politic. Yes, conservatives were more deferential than liberals, but liberals were really deferential also. Men were more deferential than women, but women were also really deferential. We didn't have nearly the stark divides that we often have when you ask people generally, do you think the United States should use force? Then we see women being really anti-militarist and men being much more gung-ho. Here, the gaps were generally much, much smaller than we are used to seeing and that we would have expected.
So why do you think public trust in the military has expanded to this point? We also noticed that this is a huge change from the Vietnam era when there was very little public trust in the military. So what has changed since then?
This is a really interesting question that you asked. And one of the things I think that might help explain this is that Americans tend to distrust experts in general. There's a lot of studies out now that show that, for example, on things like climate science, that Americans don't trust experts. But it seems the one exception they make is trust in the military. And I think this may stem from sort of a broader distrust in politicians or bureaucrats or the Washington elite. And this then leaves Americans, in terms of this question of whether to use force or what have you, more trusting of the military. But it may also be that the military is seen as apolitical, right? Whereas obviously the civilian leadership in Washington is anything but apolitical. The military is sort of seen as this institution that not only has a lot of honor and respect behind it in terms of public displays of gratitude towards the military and stuff like that, but also that the military has traditionally tried to keep out of politics, or at least keep that air about them. And so I think that might be one explanation.
Let me just add a couple things. I think, as your question noted, we used to think that maybe this was about performance. Right? Trust in the military and respect for the military was very low, understandably, in the 1970s, which led to the establishment of the all-volunteer force. And many people have forgotten that the all-volunteer force was essentially deemed a failure in the late 1970s. There was even serious talk about returning to the draft. Of course, that all turned around with the Persian Gulf War in 1991, and the great success of the U.S. military in facing down a tin pot dictator, but a military that was thought to be at that time to be the fifth best military in the world. So people used to think this was about performance, and obviously it's hard to ascribe that to the sort of continuing trust in the military to questions of performance today. A study was recently published that said, well, there's a big partisan divide on these questions of trust in the military, and that's true, but it can't all be ascribed to partisanship and political ideology. And so one thing that I think Robert is right, that there is an apolitical stereotype of the military, but I think there has also been, for reasons that we don't fully understand, clearly a conscious effort to promote a certain mythologizing of the military. Today, we recruit our military on the basis of market incentives. And there is absolutely no question that some substantial proportion of those who sign up for military service today, of those who volunteer, do so because of the financial benefits associated with military service. And when the military does not offer sufficiently generous financial benefits, especially when the economy and the job market are humming as they are today, they miss their quotas, they miss their targets. The Secretary of the Army just gave an interview along these lines and in fact admitted this has been a real challenge for the military. The U.S. economy is humming. The job market is very tight. It is very hard for them to recruit soldiers right now. And yet we never talk about service that way. I challenge you to find a politician who talks about the military as if it were just a job. We talk about our soldiers as if they were always paragons of citizenship, serving for reasons of patriotism, heroes who sacrifice on the nation's behalf. One of the other questions we asked in our survey, which we did not report in this article, asked about people about why they think soldiers serve, and asked soldiers why they in fact think that soldiers serve. And here we had a striking difference. The American public, we discovered, was about equally divided between perceptions and stories of military service that focused on intrinsic motivations, things like patriotism and duty, and extrinsic motivations, that is, things like military benefit, things like financial benefits. People were about equally divided. Soldiers themselves know the real deal. And soldiers themselves, veterans, were especially veterans of the all-volunteer force, we discovered were far more likely to say that soldiers serve for reasons of financial benefits. So we have a strong elite rhetorical line that says over and over, these are our heroes, these are paragons of American citizens, these are citizen soldiers. And that, I think, plays a role. Now, why have politicians put forward this line? Well, that is a subject would be really quite speculative on our part. And I think it's something that we simply don't fully understand, why this real norm has emerged that continues to reinforce this notion that our professional soldiers are citizen soldiers. It should be noted, this is not a uniform around the world. Today, across the West, militaries are recruited on a market basis. The United States is not alone in this kind of rhetoric, but it is certainly not the case that every nation puts forward this sort of rhetoric. In Britain, for instance, they are far more likely to emphasize the professionalism of their nation's soldiers, to emphasize this is a job and a career, something you don't really hear spoken of, at least out of the mouths of American politicians.
Thanks for joining us for part 1 of this conversation with Dr. Ronald Krebs and Mr. Robert Ralston. You can find the link to their original foreign policy article in the show notes. And be sure to follow us on Twitter at TYFYS_podcast to get the latest updates about the show.
Also, please don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Spreaker so you'll get our next episode as soon as it's released. Thank You for Your Service is produced by Nick Perezzo, Haz Yano, and Alec McMillan. Special thanks to Ashwarya Kumar and Mary Martha McClay for production and scripting support. This podcast is a production of University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts and is in no way intended to reflect the official positions of the Department of Defense or any other military entity. I'm Thomas Krasnican.
And I'm Sarah Claudy. See you next time.
Hi, this is Jason Zukas, the host of Have You Heard? The UC3P News Quiz, a podcast where we quiz University of Chicago students on recent entertaining news stories. You can find us on any podcast platform by searching for Have You Heard UC3P and can find out more about our upcoming live shows at facebook.com/HYH News Quiz. Thanks for listening.